welcome everyone to this new episode of our show. Today we have the pleasure of having with us Shardul Phadnis, who is an associate professor of operations and supply chain management at the Asia School of Business, which is a collaboration between MIT Sloan Management and Bank Negara Malaysia. Shardul's research explores the intersection of supply chains and strategic management, and is particularly interested in understanding how basically we can orchestrate the supply chain operations to create real value, and how strategy processes influence the adaptability and the resilience of supply chain infrastructures. He has published in several top journals. I'm just going to name a few: SMJ, Strategic Management Journal, Production and Operations Management, Academy of Management Perspectives, MIT Sloan Management Review, and there is more. It's a very long, and he also authored the book, Strategic Planning for Dynamic Supply Chains, Preparing for Uncertainty Using Scenarios. A very interesting book where he describes first-hand applications of scenario planning for strategic supply chain decisions in business and government. He's also an associate editor of Futures and Foresight Science, a PhD in engineering systems from MIT. So I guess we are talking definitely to a very informed, skilled person today, and I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting conversation. Thank you for your time, Shardul.
My pleasure.
And
Thank you for having me on the podcast.
to kick off, I would like to ask a little bit more, about your academic journey and the work you do.
All right. Well, thank you very much again for having me on the podcast. And as you mentioned, I have a PhD in engineering, but all my education is in engineering. So from undergraduate, a couple of master's degrees until PhD, it was all about manufacturing engineering, industrial engineering, and later on moving towards systems and supply chain management and systems engineering systems. So as a result of that, I have kind of a inclination to be not just as a scholar, we are PhDs, so we look at questions and we say, what's going on here? And try to kind of uncover the nature of reality. So in addition to that, I also have like a strong problem-solving motivation, and that might show up as we continue through this conversation. So in addition to that background, I also worked in the industry. So between my 2 master's degrees, I spent about 7 years in the industry working on various types of jobs, but my longest and the last job was the head of lean promotion office at a small manufacturing company in Maryland. And part of the job was to kind of create, or as my boss said, implement lean. You don't implement lean, right? But you kind of inculcate that lean culture. So I have that's an experience that has stayed with me, really doing things on the shop floor. And when I come to the academia, I have continued to work with the industry. So fortunately, where I got my PhD at MIT's Center for Transportation and Logistics, where I met Francesco as well, we had a very applied orientation that you are concerned about creating theory and kind of advancing knowledge, but also what knowledge you advance was determined by what are the problems that the industry is facing, the problems that the society is facing. So kind of the application motivated research is what I do. So I continue to do my research on supply chains and strategic management at the intersection of that, as you mentioned in the opening. But also in the last few years, I've realized that the knowledge that we have about supply chain management and operations management, there's a lot more we can do than just apply it to corporations. For the last 4 or 5 years, I have been working with a nonprofit. And Paolo, you mentioned that you are interested in sustainability, and that is a big topic for us, right? I mean, this is a issue that we need to address. And for the last more than 4 years, I've been working with a sustainable food bank that you might find interesting. It's called the Lost Food Project. It's a kind of a unique food bank. It happens to be one of the largest food banks in Malaysia. In some years, we were the number 1 based on the volume of food that we donated. But this is a food bank. It is unique in the sense that it collects only surplus food that would otherwise be going to the landfill or being incinerated, somehow wasted. Wasted. And it collects that and distributes that to people who need it. And there are a lot of people. There's a lot of urban poverty. There are charities, orphanages, elderly people's homes, and so on. They need the food. They need the nutritious food. So this is a supply chain. I mean, that's how I got involved with this organization. They created a supply chain that connected the surplus food that was going to the waste, and there was a demand, unmet demand. And they said, okay, how can we connect these two nodes efficiently, in a safe manner, effectively? So kind of last bit is that so I was on the board of this charity for more than three and a half years. Last 2.5 years, I served as the president of the board. I just stepped down, and now I'm president emeritus, hoping to create more academic collaboration between the Lost Food Project and Asia School of Business. But that's kind of
Fantastic.
briefly my background. You can see the engineer coming out right now. You're writing
Yeah,
papers, you're doing research, but also you're trying to make an impact through practice.
exactly. No,
Excellent.
Shardul, this is so interesting, and I think you started to hit the point going to second question. That is, hey, supply chain is really more than, application to inventory management. There's really something more, and it's becoming more, more and more with years. You mentioned like in the last 5 years, becoming also way more than you started. We met 10 years ago, kind of at the MIT, probably with globalization at its peak. You
Mhm.
remember that? Like, I remember I was checking like price of Brent to determine like the scenarios to, container come away from US, from China. The thing is, you said rightly, everything changed so fast. In the last 5 years, we had so many shifts we can't imagine, and in the environment we are living in, we are facing a sort of globalization becoming something else.
Mhm.
Maybe regionalization. What's happening? That's the question.
Yeah.
Your perspective. What's happening? What happened in the last 10 years?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, Francesco, you mentioned the work we did at MIT, and you probably remember this project that we had, Future Freight Flows. Chris
Yes.
Kaplis was leading this project, and part of that project was, the goal of this project was to create a set of scenarios and a process for using them that any transportation planning agency in the United States could use to make their infrastructure planning. In that case, it was freight infrastructure. So you're thinking about building highways or expanding highways, deepening the ports, or adding new rail lines and stuff like that. Where exactly should you invest your tax dollars so that the region is prepared for the future needs, future freight needs? And when you're thinking about building infrastructure like that, you're not just thinking next quarter or next year. You're thinking, in that particular case, the planning horizon was 30 years.
Exactly.
So, how do you think about 30 years from now, all the
That's
things that may
impossible.
happen? Yeah. And so that's where the scenario planning came in. We created scenarios. We went around the country and did several workshops applying those scenarios. And all that data that we collected in the workshops, that actually informed the infrastructure planning decisions at these different agencies. So one of the scenarios you might remember is that we had 4 scenarios. One was what everybody believed at that time in 2010 was what the future was going to be. We called it global marketplace. And this was a scenario where there is seamless flow of goods, information, money, people, what have you, among all countries, flat world, no boundaries at all. And that's what we used to do these workshops and say, hey, look, this is one of the 4 scenarios. And there were 3 others that I'll mention a couple of them. And at the end of the workshop, we'll say, look at all these 4 scenarios, which is the most likely. And everybody thought the future was going to be the global marketplace. But then there was another scenario that the world breaks down into smaller blocks. And we said, well, there is maybe Europe or European Union is a block. China and Africa was on the block in that scenario. North America was a block. South America was a block. And not many people really believe that that could be the world. But if you look around the world today, it looks more like that scenario, which we call NAFTA-STIC. It looks more like NAFTA-STIC than
Yeah.
global marketplace. And there were a couple other scenarios. But let's come back to today. Now, you asked me, what are my views about globalization? So if you look at global trade, it's about 1/3 of the global GDP. Right? Global GDP is about $100 trillion. Global trade is about $33 trillion, so about 1/3. That is a significant chunk. And this is just GDP, trade in goods. Okay, I'm not thinking about trade in services. They're just in goods, physical stuff that has to move. This cannot disappear overnight, right? So I remember during COVID, there was a talk of global supply chains are dead. Well, this is not disappearing right away. Sanity check. If you look at how many countries can make their own cars. Well, if you look at the auto production, there are 3 countries in the world that produce about 50% of all the cars. That is China, US, and Japan. there are about 20, 25 countries that produce more than 95% of the cars. Okay, so and just now, one of the biggest industries. So if you want to buy cars, there's a good chance they are going to be imported. You talk about semiconductors, talk about pharmaceuticals, all kinds of products. So not every country produces what it needs. Global trade is not going away. Now there's this whole discussion of tariffs because that's what the news environment we are in right now. Since February of this year, there's a talk of tariffs with the new Trump administration. And it seems like, well, that's going to kill globalization. It's going to kill global supply chains. But let's just take a step back and look at the tariffs themselves. There is so much uncertainty in the way the tariffs have been announced and changed again, and where they stand. I mean, I was just looking at what has happened to the tariffs that are announced by the Trump administration in the second term. Now, in February, they were announced, right? And this was initially China, Mexico, and Canada, 25% on Canada and Mexico, 10% on China. But that changed really quickly. And now then there was a 30-day suspension for Mexico and Canada. And then March came, and then the suspension kind of the timeline ended. And then there were Canada and Mexico said, hey, now we are going to impose our tariffs. Okay, so then the kind of a escalation started.
Yeah.
Then in April, we saw that famous chart. Right now, you have all the countries with kind of reciprocal tariffs. 10% is the baseline, and it went very high up from there. And
we
then,
remember very well here, sir.
Yeah. And then that started kind of a retaliation from China. And now I don't even know what the tariffs on China are. It's like 125%, maybe even higher. Right? There was a talk of going up to 200%. But then there's a suspension for most of those high tariffs have been suspended for, I guess, 3 months now. And there's a negotiation going on, between different countries. So we don't even know if this is a lasting thing or this is just something temporary that is meant to bring countries to the negotiation table. And as you know, I mean, you both are supply chain experts. Supply chains are not built overnight. Right? It takes several months. It takes like years. You're building factories. You are finding suppliers. You're developing the suppliers. You are creating relationships, right? It takes years to do this. And when there's so much
and also let me chime in a little. At this point, then M&A activities and market point of view, hold on, because in uncertainty, who keeps the money to invest says, let me pause for a little to see what's going to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because at the end of the day, as you're mentioning, the thing is that climate is going to be uncertain, and uncertain means on hold, and on hold, it's like pausing the entire system, and the entire system is a collateral damage to be posed.
Mm-hmm. Very true. So it just that uncertainty has to resolve, right, before we can see any kind of maybe concrete steps that companies are going to take and say, hey, if they start building a factory in the U.S., is this trade environment and the costs that you're looking at total landed costs, right? Is that going to remain the same, or that's going to change? And there are examples. We saw companies like, so we write about Peloton, great example, right? Great company, but they decided to build a factory in Ohio in 2021, and so started construction on it. It was a $400 million factory. 9 months after the construction started, they abandoned it. So we are not going to make anything in this factory. We are going to keep our contract suppliers in Taiwan, right? So why did that happen? Now, there was a lot of difficulty getting goods into the U.S. early on in 2020, 2021, early on in the pandemic, because of the port closures and the logjam at the ports and so on. But once that resolved, once the vaccines came out and things became normal fairly quickly in the United States, at least. Now, people say, hey, they are going out now. I don't need to buy a home treadmill if I can just run outside or if I can go to my gym. So things change. Things can change fairly quickly. So now kind of coming to this point of globalization, is it even going to be regionalization? I don't even know. So what is a region? So at one time, if you would have thought, well, maybe North America is going to be one trading region. Is that so? We don't know. I mean, there are tariffs being imposed on Canada and Mexico. Can we think of that as a region anymore? Who knows? With all this kind of animosity that is coming out because of these tariffs and trade war, Maybe other countries are getting closer. So China is getting closer to Europe. So is that a region? China already has a significant presence in Southeast Asia. It is embedded deeply in Africa. So is that a region? So we don't even know. There's so much uncertainty right now. So if you ask me, like a scenario planning guy, I'll say, well, we just have to think about multiple scenarios and not really settle on one particular view of the future at this time.
Yeah, that is amazing. Of course, regions or trade regions or, and it changed, industry by industry has a great impact on the value chain.
Mhm.
Value chain is like the title of this podcast, future of the value chain. To highlight this again, what's your perspective for you? Which are the key drivers impacting, let's say general, not specific in industry, but the future of the value chain? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah. So I think this kind of the global trade and the trade barriers or treaties, maybe bilateral treaties, multilateral treaties, as well as geopolitical tensions, I think that is going to remain a significant driving force in the future. But right now, when I say right now, we're talking about early 2025, right? The first half of year 2025. The discussion is so much dominated by tariffs and the trade war that there are other important underlying drivers that we are not paying as much attention to. So obviously one of those is kind of the AI and more broadly digitization, or you can call it the industry 4.0, right? Like a really host of technologies, information technologies that really have the power to transform manufacturing and supply chains. Okay, so let's just think about things like, for example, Internet of Things, sensors. Many companies are embarking on these projects. They are collecting data from the machines in their smart factories and so on. But what they are still figuring out, there's no kind of, this is not settled yet at all by any stretch, is so much data coming in. What exactly do we do with that data? More importantly, how do we create value out of that data? Right? So how do we design our operations differently? Can we create new business models? Because we are getting this real-time information from sensors and vehicles and things like that. So that kind of the, say, digital advances as well as AI, I think will be a significant driver. So that's the second. A third is sustainability, and both of you do work in this area, so you know a lot about this. And companies are struggling actually because companies have their assets invested in kind of the old technology, old energy, right? So we have the fossil energy, and transitioning away from that is not easy. So I live in Malaysia. Malaysia is a big oil and gas country. One of the biggest company here is Petronas, that is kind of the national oil and gas company, is a significant contributor to the GDP of the country. If there was a transition away from oil and gas, how would that look like? How should the country manage that transition? So we don't have clear answers to that. But at the same time, we are seeing the adverse effects of global climate change. We are seeing more extreme weather events, droughts, flooding. A few months ago, there was news about water levels in Panama Canal being down, and ships beyond a certain size couldn't pass through the canal because of that, as a result of climate change. So we are going to start seeing these adverse effects more and more frequently. At the same time, we are struggling to transition away from kind of the fossil energy. So that focus on sustainability, I think, is going to be a key important driver as well. A couple other I would say is that I've been living in Asia for the last 10 years, and Asia has changed a lot in this millennium. Asia is very powerful. There's a lot of economic power here. It's not just China and India after that. Southeast Asia, or rather the ASEAN, which is a group of 10 countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, and so on. This is a big bloc. About 700 million people live here. The GDP of Southeast Asia, ASEAN, is 4 trillion in the real terms and about 3 times as much in purchasing power parity. So this is a big bloc. So there's a lot of economic power. And I think that there's going to be a gradual continued shift more towards Asia in terms of economic power. So as Asia becomes more dominant economically, how does that affect our global business, affect our global supply chains? I think that would be an interesting driver as well. And lastly, we have to think about the consumer, right? So we know that Gen Z consumer, for example, they care a lot about the environment, but they don't always put their money where their mouth is, right? So they'll care about the environment and then they'll go on Shein or Temu and they'll buy these fast fashion items that we know that they are not really good for the environment. So at the same time, there's a strong influence of social media, and this younger consumer thinks differently in their buying habits, in their work attitudes, and so on. So that's another driver to consider. So if you think about these 5, 6 different drivers, paints a very interesting picture of the world about how it's going to look like in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I would like Shardul to come, ask you a little bit to elaborate on this topic of, the impact of sustainability as a broad theme on global value chains. And I guess, when in the moment we start declining the acronym ESG, there are many, I guess, factors there that might play, a role in decision making in the context of supply chain design and value chain design. I guess, an obvious one, could be, for example, the topic of working conditions in factories. That topic has been, a big deal over the years for some organizations, like, for example, Nike, and led them to, I guess, approach supply chain design and sourcing, with different logics. In the context of like these, factors that you were mentioning, when you basically look at the topic of sustainability, do you recognize a specific themes and drivers there that you believe are going to be relevant in the future?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, right? And definitely working conditions or kind of the treatment of humans in supply chains is getting a lot more attention. And is not just in, let's say, organizational behavior or these disciplines, but also in operations management. So Nike factory is a great example that you gave. There are studies that have come out that have looked at a kind of modern slavery, slavery in, say, fishing in, say, kind of South China Sea. And people have done studies about fishing industry in, say, Thailand. And are people working there willingly or they're kind of forced into those conditions? There are questions about modern day slavery in, say, maybe plantations and things like that. So that is a topic that is of interest. Yeah, certainly working conditions. And about a few years ago, almost 10 years ago now, remember when there was the accident in Bangladesh, the Rana Plaza factory collapse?
Of course,
Yeah,
more
yeah.
than
And
1,200 people died,
more than
1,300.
12 people, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Disproportionately women, because garment manufacturing, you have disproportionately high women employees. And at that time, there was focus. No, companies realized that we care about not only the money that we pay, but also how people are treated in those conditions. So I think that
Yeah.
that is going to become important. Another thing that when I think about the kind of the environmental sustainability, I look at it from kind of my background of say, scenario planning and thinking for the long term, kind of infrastructure planning and the uncertainty aspect of that. There's a huge degree of uncertainty when we think about transitioning away from, say, fossil energy to, say, clean energy. Now, let's say if you're thinking about building windmill farm, you're talking about building towers that are 300 meters tall. There's the number of parts that go into making a windmill. Literally, we're talking about thousands of parts. Somebody has to manufacture them. The equipment has to be transferred to the site. You need regular maintenance of these windmills. So you need to create kind of the talent or support system that people who can support these. So if you decide, okay, we are going to invest in wind energy, that decision itself requires you to have kind of supporting industries in manufacturing and the people who can service it and so on and so forth. And so that is, again, we are thinking about the long term. We are thinking about making investments for the next 10, 15, 20 years. And for that, we need to know which technology do we want to invest in. Wind energy the right energy to invest in? Or should we be thinking about solar? Should we be thinking about hydrogen or something else? Right? What would be the relative cost benefits of different technologies? So that all that uncertainty comes into the play. And again, for that, we need some kind of a systematic way to deal with that uncertainty. So instead of being now just stuck, which is where we are, not being able to make progress, we can at least start making progress in a gradual fashion.
Yeah.
interesting, excellent. Now, this is actually. It's interesting you mentioned the Rana Plaza because it's one of the cases I use in my MBA elective here at UCL, and it became, as you will remember, a big deal for many fashion brands. I guess I was mentioning before Nike when I was asking you the question, and Nike was probably the only big brand that didn't become involved in the situation because their team had visited the place months before, the tragic accident happened, and they basically thought it was, far too risky to operate in that environment. So thanks to this kind of ESG guess mindset, they didn't become involved in the scandal and in the situation. I guess from so I ask you, to reflect on the future from a sustainability perspective. But now I want to kind of leverage your operations mindset in the next question. So bring it back to the traditional, operations KPIs and kind of factors that drive supply chain design. What do you think are going to be the key elements that will influence the decision making in the future from from a pure operations perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, global value chains. Now, it's a very important topic in operations management, right? So that's a given. But what else is important? So I teach operations management at Asia School of Business, and I think so. When we talk about operations management, we have to start with fundamentals, right? So basic operations management course, I talk about inventory management, forecasting, production scheduling, queuing theory, and then we talk about, okay, supply chains, right? So real basic understanding that has to be there, but it is not enough. We cannot just say, well, no, that's where we stand, and then we cannot just say, well, there was the American School of Manufacturing with the assembly line and so on in 1910s onwards, and then there was the Japanese school, the kind of the Toyota production system came along. We are moving way beyond that, right? So going beyond these fundamentals, what is important? So we actually have this kind of program at Asia School of Business. We call it Operations for 21st Century.
Mhm.
And what we are looking at that is saying that in operations management, we have a lot more interesting and challenging topics, and we don't have good answers for them. So that's number one. We need to kind of find out how do we address these challenges for the industry, and maybe we have to work with the industry to find these answers out. So that's number one. But at the same time, operations, in my opinion, there is a lot of untapped potential in operations management. I'll give you an example of this. So we often think about operations as, so the business decides what product we are going to make. There's a business strategy, and then operations guys, here you go, just make it and deliver it. That's how
Yeah.
we think of operations, but it's very limiting. I think we can create value, novel value, and especially value in addressing kind of the sustainable development goals purely by designing business models that are based on operations. So I'll give you an example of that. The food bank that I
Please
mentioned,
do.
the
Yeah.
Lost Food Project. So what Lost Food Project does is it collects surplus food from one place and delivers it to the people who need it. It's not a typical food bank because no. So Lost Food Project has a little bit of storage place in the warehouse, but it's a cross-docking operation.
Exactly.
85% of the food that we distribute is fresh produce, fruits and veggies. It's not canned food or pasta or rice that has long shelf life. No. So fruits and veggies, you need to move them fast. So we collect them surplus, and this is all surplus food that would otherwise be discarded. We collect it from the wholesale market, the largest wholesale market in Kuala Lumpur, called Pasar Borong, Kuala Lumpur, and we take it straight to the beneficiaries. 5 days a week, 6 days on one additional day, we bring it to the distribution center, we sort it and give it to small charities. Now, what you have here is basically this is supply chain innovation. Somebody, the founders and other people who have been working with this charity, have figured out how can we collect food, process it, handle it in a safe manner, and distribute it in a transparent, equitable manner, so
Mhm.
that the food reaches the actual beneficiary who are going to eat it. They are not going to sell the food to somebody else. And then it is transparent. So if the donor wants to know who received the surplus food I had given, you have complete record of that. How do you make it happen? You make it happen by following hardcore operations processes, which we call SOPs, standard operating processes. So somebody figured out in this organization, now the founder Suzanne Mooney and the people who worked with her, they figured out how do we put together a system of these processes so that we can create value. Create value not just by feeding the people who need the nutritious food, but also by reducing food that is getting thrown away.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So it's a business model based on operations management. So I think that is for me, that is quite exciting because now you're thinking about innovating. You're thinking about creating value by leveraging your operations and supply chain management expertise, as opposed to just being the guys who are moving trucks, driving trucks and making goods and moving goods. Nothing wrong with that, but there's a lot more we can do.
Fantastic.
Yeah, exactly, Shardul. And I think you enhanced, the next question. You said rightly again, like, hey, we can create value, we can leverage, our supply chain skills, sort of, that it's way more than what historically was thought to be, especially for the delivery part, like, manage inventory and deliver. That's much more than that. We can design operating model so to create value and revolutionize like the entire business here. So the natural question is, to be successful, which are the set of competencies, the skill, for supply chain that are like key to have today.
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is something that we ask ourselves. And Paolo, I'm sure you do as well, being an academic, right? We are
Yeah,
training the next generation of business leaders, organizational leaders, and we are training them to be competent in operations and supply chain management. What do we teach them? So, as I mentioned before, kind of the fundamentals of operations and supply chain, you need to know that, right? Before we ask the question about how are the tariffs going to affect us, we need to know, okay, how do we even think about answering that question? So we need to know what is inventory management and how the
yeah,
tariffs might affect that. We need to know about the architecture of the operating system, right? The famous Hayes wheelwright paper, when we talk about it could be a job shop or a continuous line or as a continuous flow line versus assembly line and so on, and which architecture you use for what products and so on. So that kind of fundamental knowledge that
yeah,
has to be there. But then we need to go beyond that and we say, look, we don't live in a world that is static or stable. It's very dynamic and it's unpredictable. And it is dynamic and unpredictable both in the short term as well as the long term. And that brings in issues about things like so short term kind of disturbances or variations. How do you deal with that? And in
yeah,
supply chain management, we call that supply chain agility, right? That you can move quickly, you can maneuver, and you can adapt to these short term differences in demand and supply. How do you build that? We're still figuring out. There are some answers, but we don't know very well. But then there are long-term variations. These things don't change rapidly over time, but they change very slowly. So think about Brexit, for example. Before Brexit went into effect in, I think it was 2020, it was 3 years before that the Brexit vote was passed. Now, several years before that, there was a sentiment that, kind of we need to have the Brits feeling that no, we need to have more autonomy and so on, right? So this is slow, gradual change that actually became permanent or that hit in 2020. So how do we adjust to these slow, gradual changes? And we call that adaptability. A classic example of that is e-commerce. E-commerce didn't come out of nowhere, right? Okay, we had the late 1990s, 2000, the dot-com bubble burst and all of that. So that's the beginning of e-commerce. It took almost 10 years before big retailers started
yeah,
struggling and started going kind of bankrupt because they couldn't compete against e-commerce. So it was a slow, gradual change. It wasn't a surprise, but it was a change. And then what that required is a fundamental change in the business model, which is very hard to do, the adaptation. So that's another thing we need to know is how do you respond to changes in the short term, but also adapt your business model over the long term. And there are companies that have done that. Dell is a great example. Remember in early 2000s, every business school was teaching the Dell case about their business model, which is they had the negative cash flow, right?
yeah,
The negative cash cycle, rather. People paid them first and then they delivered the product. It was completely make to order. But around 2007, 2008, they realized that the model wasn't useful anymore. And they did a complete 180-degree change and moved to make to stock. So it was a successful adaptation. So things like that, we need to know how to do this. And to my last point there, maybe a couple other points, but what that means is it is particularly challenging in operations because operations executives, operations managers, by the nature of their job, are focused on here and now. They are thinking about, are we meeting this week's production targets or the month's production
yeah,
targets?
yeah,
Maybe quarter, that's it. So and they are really good at that. We are very, very good at that. kind of the short-term response. But at the same time, these are the same people who become the vice president of operations and the chief supply chain officers and COOs and so on. And they will
Tough.
say,
It's
do we have
tough.
the right supply chain infrastructure? Now you have to think 3, 5, 10 years out. How can you pay attention to very small changes that are happening on a daily and weekly basis, maybe monthly basis, and at the same time be aware of what's changing very slowly over the next 5, 10 years and adapt to that? That's very difficult. And that's why when I do research in scenario planning, it has become clear to me that we need some process like scenario planning to help organizations shift between these two kind of time scales. Yes, they will focus their time on day-to-day operations, say most of the time, but maybe once a month, you have to come back to the kind of longer term and say, see what's happening on the long term. So we are not going to miss any big changes. So kind of going beyond just pure operations management, we have to think about processes like scenario planning that allow us to shift between different time scales, going from like a weekly level to multi-year level. And lastly, now we talk about the skills, with digitization, advent of AI,
Yeah.
we need to know how to be, there's so much we can do with AI. We need to know how to really exploit that capability. So
Yeah.
that's a essential skill set.
Thanks, Shardul. Also, yeah, about you gathered an incredible experience across academics, but also industry, and you also have been exposed to an international career, across the world, and you experience a lot of, people and culture and, a lot of environments. Is there any, particular lesson learned you got across all these years, or any like maybe benchmark experience, anything really relevant, maybe one or more cases you want to share with us? I think it could be a great value for this podcast.
Yeah, well, so I guess one of the biggest lessons learned is how much you can learn from others, and really the ability to leverage your network is super important. And for people like me, it doesn't come naturally because personally, I was focused on, okay, what am I going to excel at? Really, what I can do myself really well, which is important. But also, there's so much resource, so many talented people around us. So we also need to figure out what can we do with this group of people. So, for example, when I was going through during my PhD program, when I started working on scenario planning, I initially thought of this scenario planning as some kind of stochastic optimization problem. It took me months to figure out I was completely on the wrong track. And that dawned on me once I started working with companies and understanding their challenges, started making presentations to my advisors and so on. And I realized how off the track I was. That scenario planning is not mathematical optimization, but it's a process of changing mindsets and allowing people to do things like kind of shifting their attention from a small weekly daily planning horizon to multi-year planning horizon. It took me years to do that, but it was working with people that helped me. Same thing with the Lost Food project that I do work with. It's incredible what a group of like-minded people who have common interests, what they can do together, and just that ability to learn from other people, being open-minded, now kind of exposing your ideas, kind of testing them out and exposing through presentations, through communications, like what you're doing with the podcast. This is fantastic. Through writing, letting people challenge you, and then you learn from that. And then also together, we come up with something better. I think that is very powerful. I think that's probably the biggest lesson I have learned over the last couple of decades.
It's amazing.
Very interesting. I guess, conscious of time, Shardul, I'm going to ask you a final question. I guess we managed to get your view on I guess what to expect in the near term. As you said, probably very hard to identify specific scenarios. So let's be ready for multiple scenarios to
Mhm.
be understood and to consider. But I guess when we change the time horizon, when we try to push it a little bit more. So let's say, for example, we don't discuss what we think is going to happen in the next 3 years, but we push it, let's say, to the next 5 to 7 years. Are there different considerations to be made, or you think that what is driving change today more or less could be what is driving change at that time?
Yeah, I think now some of the things that we talked about would still be there. I think right now there's a very strong focus on trade wars and tariffs and things like that. But other things that are important that are remaining muted in the discussion right now because of the focus in the news per se. Things like, say, digital advances and so on. A couple of things we didn't talk about. One is quantum computing. Now, this is something
Mm,
I haven't been paying very close attention to, but it seems like there are a lot of developments here that we need to pay attention to. And the second is kind of the biotech advances, also kind of coming together of biology and information technology. So you're thinking about nanomedicine and kind of targeted medical treatments and things like that. So even though that may not be hardcore operations management, but that is I mean, it has operations implications, but that is something to look out for as well, in addition to what we discussed.
fantastic. I guess, Shardul, it was really, a privilege to have you in our show. Your comments and ideas, I found them particularly insightful. So I'm sure our audience is gonna really enjoy this episode. And I guess the fact that, in a way, we are similar, not only being, I guess, academics, but having some real experience in the
Mhm.
industry. I guess that brings the conversation to a different level.
Absolutely.
And because this podcast is followed mainly by, I guess, an audience of practitioners, I think they're gonna, really appreciate your practical and pragmatic view at the same time of business. So wonderful to have you. Hopefully, if you pass by London, we are gonna get the opportunity to have you in person here at
Certainly.
UCL. But generally, congratulations for the good work you're doing, the good research, and I guess the inspiring others is another big element that I believe creates a lot of value, and I commend you on that as well.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for having me on the podcast. I really enjoyed it and look forward to meeting in person soon.
Thank
Yes,
you.
inspiring others. Paulo said, well, you did it. Thanks, Shardul, for being here. Of course, if you pass to New York, happy to meet again.
Absolutely. Okay. Thanks, Paolo. Thank you,
Thank
Francesco.
you. Bye.
Nice speaking with you guys.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed this discussion, we invite you to like and share this episode on your social media. Enjoy the rest of your day.